In December 1944, when most people believed the war in Europe was already nearing its end, something unexpected began moving in the forests of the Ardennes. The front line looked quiet, almost exhausted after months of Allied advances across France and Belgium. American units were resting, refitting, and preparing for what many thought would be the final push into Germany. Then, before dawn on December 16th, the silence shattered. Thousands of German artillery guns opened fire at once. Entire sectors of the American line disappeared in smoke and snow within minutes. This was Adolf Hitler's last major gamble in the West. The plan was bold, desperate, and risky even by German standards. Germany would strike through the Ardennes, the same region used in the 1940 invasion of France. Hitler believed the Allies had grown overconfident. If German forces could break through quickly, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp, the Allied armies would be split in half. British and American forces would be separated, supply lines would collapse, and perhaps the Western Allies might even consider negotiating peace. To achieve this, Germany gathered some of its remaining experienced formations, including powerful panzer armies. Commanders like Field Marshal Walter Model and General Hasso von Manteuffel were tasked with turning Hitler's vision into reality. They understood the risks immediately. Germany was running low on fuel, equipment, and trained soldiers, but surprise was still possible. Winter weather would ground Allied aircraft, and the dense Ardennes forests could hide troop movements. If speed was maintained, the gamble might work. At first, the attack achieved exactly what the Germans hoped for. American units along the front were shocked by the scale of the assault. Roads filled with refugees, damaged vehicles, and retreating troops. Communications broke down. Some American regiments were surrounded within hours. Others fought stubbornly, but were pushed back by waves of German infantry and armor emerging from the snowy woods. German columns advanced westward, creating a deep bulge in the Allied front line. This would later give the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. On maps in Allied headquarters, the line bent dramatically, as if someone had pressed a fist into it. For several days, the situation looked dangerously unstable. German units captured towns, crossroads, and supply depots. Rumors spread quickly. Some officers feared the Germans might reach the Meuse River. Yet, in the middle of this chaos, stood a small Belgian town that suddenly became far more important than anyone had expected. Bastogne was not a huge city. It was a quiet place surrounded by forests and farmland. But 7 major roads passed through it. In military terms, that made it a nerve center. Any army moving through the Ardennes needed those roads. German commanders understood this immediately. If Bastogne fell quickly, their armored divisions could continue west without delay. If it stayed in Allied hands, traffic jams and confusion would slow the offensive, and time was something Germany did not have. American units began moving toward Bastogne almost as soon as the scale of the attack became clear. Among them were paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division. Many of these soldiers had only recently come off rest duty in France. Some had been sleeping in warm buildings just days earlier. Now they were suddenly loaded into trucks and sent toward the front in freezing weather, not fully aware of how serious the situation had become. As they arrived, the picture grew darker. German forces were already moving around the town from several directions. Armored spearheads were pushing through nearby villages. Columns of tanks appeared on snow-covered roads. By December 20th, Bastogne was nearly surrounded. German planners believed the town would fall quickly. From their perspective, the situation seemed straightforward. American units were scattered, the weather favored Germany, and their armored forces still carried considerable striking power.
Capturing Bastogne looked like a matter of time. But something unexpected was happening on the other side of the battlefield. American resistance was becoming stronger rather than weaker. Small groups of soldiers delayed entire German columns. Engineers destroyed bridges and blocked roads. Artillery units fired until their barrels overheated. Even when forced to retreat, many units slowed the German timetable. This delay was dangerous for the German plan. The offensive depended on momentum. Fuel supplies were limited, and every hour mattered. Field commanders began noticing that progress was already slightly behind schedule. What should have been a fast breakthrough was turning into a struggle for key positions. Still, the attack continued to push west. German headquarters maps showed arrows moving deeper into Allied territory. Some officers allowed themselves cautious optimism. Perhaps the gamble might still succeed. But then, reports kept returning to one location again and again: Bastogne. Instead of collapsing, the defenses there were strengthening. American troops were digging in. Anti-tank guns were placed along likely approach routes. Artillery observers climbed into church towers and hills to spot German movements. The town was turning into a defensive knot right in the path of the German advance. German commanders now faced a difficult choice. They could bypass Bastogne and keep moving west, leaving enemy forces behind them. Or they could surround it and eliminate the threat before continuing. Neither option was ideal. Meanwhile, winter tightened its grip on the Ardennes. Snow covered forests and fields. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Soldiers on both sides fought not only each other, but the cold. Weapons jammed. Engines froze during the night. Wounded men risked freezing before reaching medical aid. Through this bitter landscape, the struggle for Bastogne was beginning to take shape. What had started as one point among many on a map was quickly becoming the center of attention for both armies. German officers studying their situation still believed they had the advantage. Their forces had achieved surprise. They had strong armored units in the area, and the Americans appeared to be reacting rather than controlling the battle. But war often changes direction in subtle ways before anyone fully realizes it. Delays that seem small on a single day can grow into major problems later. A crossroads held for a few extra hours can disrupt an entire offensive. In the coming days, Bastogne would test those assumptions. Because, unknown to many German commanders at that moment, events were already unfolding elsewhere that would soon threaten the entire offensive. Far to the south, an American general famous for speed, aggression, and relentless movement was studying the situation closely. And he was already planning something that many officers believed was impossible.
Snow fell almost constantly over the forests and fields around Bastogne. By the time the town was fully surrounded in late December 1944, the soldiers defending it understood that they were now alone. Roads leading in and out were cut. German armor controlled the surrounding villages. Columns of enemy troops could be seen moving through the woods in several directions. The encirclement was nearly complete. Inside the perimeter were thousands of American soldiers, including much of the 101st Airborne Division. Many had arrived only days earlier after being rushed from reserve positions. They had not expected to fight immediately, and certainly not under these conditions. Winter clothing was incomplete for many of them. Ammunition and food were limited. Medical supplies were already running low. The cold quickly became one of the most dangerous enemies. Temperatures dropped well below freezing during the night. Foxholes filled with ice. Soldiers wrapped their boots in cloth, burlap, or anything they could find to keep their feet from freezing. Some had only thin gloves or none at all. Frostbite cases began to appear even before the heaviest fighting started. German forces surrounding Bastogne
believed the situation was temporary. From their perspective, the town was cut off, heavily outnumbered, and unlikely to hold for long. Armored divisions were moving westward, and clearing Bastogne was simply one more task in the larger offensive. If the Americans surrendered quickly, the advance could continue without delay. But the defense forming around the town was becoming more organized with every passing hour. Artillery units were positioned to cover the roads leading into Bastogne. Infantry dug defensive lines in frozen ground that was so hard it sometimes took hours just to deepen a foxhole. Tank destroyers were hidden along likely German approach routes. Every road intersection became a potential battlefield. Leadership inside the town also mattered. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, was suddenly responsible for holding a position that German forces were closing around from all sides. Communication with higher headquarters was unreliable. At times, it was unclear when or if relief might arrive. German patrols probed the American defenses repeatedly. Small engagements broke out in forests, farmhouses, and along snowy roads. Sometimes visibility was only a few dozen meters through falling snow and fog. In those conditions, soldiers often heard tanks before they saw them. The sound of engines moving slowly through the trees could create sudden panic in defensive lines. Artillery fire became a constant presence. German guns shelled the town and surrounding positions day and night. Buildings caught fire. Aid stations filled with wounded men. Medics worked in freezing temperatures, often without enough equipment. Stretchers moved through streets covered with snow and debris. Despite the pressure, the defenders understood something important about their position. Bastogne was not just another town. 7 major roads passed through it, making it one of the most important transportation hubs in the Ardennes. If the Germans captured it quickly, their armored columns could move freely in several directions. If Bastogne held out, those same roads would remain blocked. This simple fact began to shape the entire battle. German commanders attempted to tighten the ring around the town. Tanks and infantry pushed closer to the perimeter. Some villages changed hands more than once as both sides fought for control of key ground. American artillery, despite limited ammunition, proved especially dangerous. Well-aimed barrages forced German units to regroup again and again. Then came one of the most famous moments of the siege. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a flag of truce. They carried a written message demanding the surrender of the surrounded forces. The note warned that continued resistance would lead to complete destruction. From a purely military standpoint, the demand was not unreasonable. The Americans were surrounded, short on supplies, and facing a larger attacking force. The message was delivered to General McAuliffe. According to several officers present, his first reaction was simple disbelief. After hearing the demand, he reportedly responded with a single word: nuts. At first, some staff members were unsure how to turn that reaction into an official reply. Eventually, the message sent back to the German delegation was just as brief. It stated one word: nuts, followed by a clarification that the American forces would not surrender. The German officers receiving the response were confused at first by the expression. Once it was explained, the meaning became clear. The siege would continue. Fighting intensified after that exchange. German commanders increased pressure around the perimeter, attempting to break through before the Americans could stabilize their defenses. Infantry attacks pushed against wooded positions. Tanks tried to force their way along narrow roads. Several assaults came dangerously close to penetrating the lines. Inside Bastogne, supplies were reaching critical levels. Ammunition for artillery was carefully rationed. Food portions were reduced. Medical personnel struggled to treat wounded soldiers without enough bandages, morphine, or plasma. Vehicles that ran out of fuel were abandoned and used as cover. Weather continued to favor the Germans for several days. Thick clouds and snowstorms grounded most Allied aircraft. That meant no air support and almost no aerial resupply for the trapped defenders. The men on the ground knew that help from the sky would not arrive unless the weather changed. Even so, the defensive line held. German officers studying their maps began noticing a problem. Bastogne was taking longer than expected. Units assigned to capture the town were being delayed. Roads that should have been opened for the advance remained contested. Traffic jams formed as armored columns tried to move around the area. Time, once again, was becoming a critical factor. Every extra day spent fighting around Bastogne slowed the larger German offensive moving west. Fuel consumption increased. Coordination between units became more difficult. The initial shock of the attack was beginning to fade as Allied commanders organized their response. Still, from the German perspective, the outcome seemed inevitable. Surrounded troops without supplies rarely held out forever. It was assumed that sooner or later the defenders would collapse or be overwhelmed. But what many commanders on both sides did not yet fully realize was that a race was already underway beyond the frozen forests surrounding Bastogne. Far to the south, powerful American forces were beginning to move. And if they arrived in time, the entire situation inside the town, and perhaps the entire German offensive, could change dramatically.
While the soldiers in Bastogne fought to hold their shrinking perimeter, events far to the south were already beginning to shift the course of the battle. In another headquarters, maps of the Ardennes were spread across large tables, covered with unit markers, supply routes, and weather reports. Officers moved pieces slowly as new information arrived from the front. The German offensive had created confusion across the Allied command structure, but one general was already thinking several moves ahead. General George S. Patton had a reputation that was impossible to ignore. He was aggressive, impatient, and constantly pushing his forces to move faster than anyone thought possible. His Third Army had been advancing across France for months, often outpacing supply lines and surprising even Allied planners. Speed, in Patton's mind, was not just an advantage, it was a weapon. When news of the German attack in the Ardennes reached higher headquarters, many Allied leaders initially focused on stopping the breakthrough. Units were rushed north to plug gaps in the front line. Commanders tried to understand the size and direction of the German assault. For a short time, the situation looked uncertain enough that some feared a major disaster. But Patton saw something else. Instead of thinking only about defense, he began considering how quickly his army could turn and attack the flank of the German advance. There was one major problem. His forces were positioned far to the south of Bastogne. The roads were crowded with other military traffic. Winter weather was slowing movement everywhere, and shifting a large army in the middle of an ongoing battle was one of the most complicated maneuvers possible. Armies are not just lines of soldiers, they are enormous systems made up of tanks, trucks, artillery, fuel convoys, engineers, medical units, and supply columns stretching for miles. Changing their direction requires careful coordination. Orders must reach dozens of divisions and support units. Routes must be planned so roads do not become completely blocked. Fuel and ammunition must arrive at the right time. One mistake can stop everything. Yet, Patton believed it could be done. Several days earlier, during a meeting with Allied commanders, he had already considered the possibility that German forces might attack through the Ardennes. While others were still reacting to the news, Patton's staff had quietly begun preparing alternative plans. If ordered, the Third Army could pivot north toward the crisis. When the moment came, Patton did not hesitate. He assured Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower that his army could disengage from its current operations, turn 90 degrees, and attack toward Bastogne in a matter of days. Some officers in the room were skeptical.
Moving a few divisions quickly was one thing. Turning an entire army in winter conditions was something else entirely. But preparations were already underway. Orders spread through the Third Army headquarters network. Units that had been facing east began preparing to move north. Tank crews checked engines in freezing temperatures. Mechanics worked through the night repairing vehicles. Convoys of trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition reorganized their routes. Military police were assigned to control traffic along icy roads that soon filled with moving columns. For many soldiers, the change happened suddenly. One day they were preparing for operations elsewhere along the front. The next, they were driving into a snowstorm toward one of the most dangerous battles in Europe. The scale of the movement was enormous. Thousands of vehicles began turning onto narrow roads that cut through forests and small towns. Tracks from tanks and half-tracks churned frozen ground into thick mud beneath the snow. Long lines of headlights stretched through the night as units pushed forward almost without pause. Weather made everything harder. Snow reduced visibility and slowed progress. Some vehicles slid off icy roads into ditches and had to be pulled free. Bridges had to be checked to ensure they could support heavy armor. Engineers moved ahead of the columns to repair routes and clear obstacles. Despite these problems, the advance continued with remarkable speed. Part of the reason was discipline and planning. Staff officers had mapped multiple routes so divisions would not interfere with each other. Fuel dumps were positioned along the path of advance. Communication units worked constantly to keep commanders informed about delays or changes. When traffic jams formed, military police redirected entire columns to alternate roads. German intelligence was aware that Allied forces were moving, but the scale and direction were not immediately clear. From their perspective, the offensive was still pushing westward. Bastogne remained surrounded, and the main effort was focused on reaching the Meuse River. Few expected a major counterattack to appear so quickly from the south. Inside Bastogne, the defenders had little information about what was happening beyond their lines. They continued fighting under the assumption that relief might take many days if it came at all. Ammunition remained scarce. Medical stations were still overwhelmed. Every German attack tested the shrinking perimeter again and again. Meanwhile, Patton's leading units were drawing closer. Armored divisions pushed ahead whenever the roads allowed it. Infantry rode on trucks or clung to the sides of tanks to save time. Artillery units struggled to keep pace, but continued moving forward. The goal was not simply to approach Bastogne. The goal was to break through the German ring as quickly as possible. The distance itself was daunting. Roughly 100 miles separated major elements of the Third Army from the surrounded town. Under normal conditions, moving such a force that far in the middle of winter would be a major operation. Doing it during an enemy offensive made the challenge even greater. Yet the movement continued day and night. Soldiers later recalled barely sleeping during the advance. Drivers rotated shifts to keep vehicles moving. Commanders pushed their units through snow-covered villages and dark forest roads illuminated only by dim lights. The urgency was clear to everyone involved. Somewhere ahead, thousands of American troops were surrounded. German commanders began receiving reports that Allied forces were appearing in areas where they had not been expected so soon. At first, these reports seemed small and scattered, a reconnaissance unit here, an armored patrol there. But gradually, a clearer picture began to form. A large force was moving north, and it was moving faster than anticipated. Field headquarters, studying their maps, started to notice something uncomfortable. The timetable of the offensive was tightening. Bastogne had not fallen yet, and now new American formations were approaching the southern flank of the German advance. What had started as a confident offensive was beginning to face pressure from multiple directions. Still, many German officers believed the encirclement around Bastogne would hold long enough to finish the job. After all, surrounding an enemy usually meant the outcome was only a matter of time. But time was exactly what was beginning to run out.
By the time the leading elements of George Patton's Third Army reached the outer edges of the battlefield, the situation around Bastogne had become extremely tense. The town was still surrounded. German units controlled most of the roads leading in. American defenders were exhausted, low on ammunition, and fighting in freezing conditions that seemed to grow worse every night. From the German perspective, the pocket was slowly tightening. From inside the town, it often felt like the pressure might finally break the line. But on December 23rd, something important changed. The weather that had blanketed the Ardennes in clouds and snow for days finally began to clear. For the first time since the German offensive started, Allied aircraft could return to the sky in large numbers. Transport planes appeared over Bastogne and dropped desperately needed supplies. Parachutes carrying ammunition, food, and medical equipment floated down into fields and roads around the town. Fighter bombers also began attacking German vehicles and artillery positions. Even with that help, the ground situation was still dangerous. German forces continued attacking the perimeter. Tanks probed the defenses, sometimes supported by infantry moving carefully through the forests. Artillery fire remained constant. Each day, the defenders waited for the sound of something else, the arrival of friendly forces pushing through from outside. South of Bastogne, Patton's advancing army was now colliding with the German outer defenses. The task in front of them was clear but difficult. German units had established blocking positions along key roads and villages. These positions had to be broken one by one before any relief column could reach the town. The terrain made everything harder. The Ardennes was not open countryside. It was a maze of forests, narrow roads, ridges, and small villages that could easily be turned into defensive strongpoints. A single disabled vehicle could block an entire route. Mines, roadblocks, and anti-tank guns forced attacking units to slow down and fight for every few miles. American armored spearheads began pushing north through this landscape. Tanks moved cautiously along icy roads, while infantry advanced beside them through snow-covered woods. When German resistance appeared, artillery was called forward to break it. Progress was steady, but never easy. In some places, the fighting became extremely close. Villages changed hands after intense firefights. Tank crews searched tree lines for hidden anti-tank guns. Infantry units cleared buildings room by room, sometimes under heavy machine gun fire. The cold affected everyone. Weapons jammed. Radios struggled to work properly. Engines had to remain running to avoid freezing overnight. Despite the resistance, the pressure from the south kept increasing. More units of the Third Army arrived and joined the advance. Commanders understood that speed was still critical. Every hour mattered for the soldiers trapped in Bastogne. Inside the town, the defenders noticed signs that something was happening beyond the German lines. Artillery fire in the distance sometimes sounded different, heavier, and coming from new directions. German units attacking the perimeter occasionally seemed distracted or rushed. Rumors spread quickly among the American troops that relief forces might be getting closer. Still, no one inside the pocket could be sure. German commanders were now facing a growing problem. Their offensive had been designed around rapid movement toward the west. Instead, resources were increasingly tied up around Bastogne. Units that should have been pushing forward were forced to defend their flanks or hold positions against the approaching American army. Reports arriving at headquarters described strong resistance south of the town. American armored forces were attacking with determination and coordination. The timetable of the offensive was slipping further. Then came the moment that many soldiers in Bastogne had been waiting for.
On December 26, 1944, one of Patton's armored spearheads finally broke through the German lines and reached the outskirts of the town. The first contact was made along a narrow road where American tanks cautiously pushed forward, unsure how strong the enemy presence still was. Eventually, they linked up with the defenders of the 101st Airborne. The siege was not completely over. Fighting continued in the surrounding areas for days afterward, but the encirclement had been broken. A corridor now connected Bastogne to the rest of the Allied forces. For the soldiers inside the town, the moment brought enormous relief. After days of isolation, freezing temperatures, and constant attacks, they were no longer alone. Supplies could move in more easily. Wounded soldiers could be evacuated. Reinforcements could arrive. The achievement was remarkable not only because the town had been reached, but because of how quickly it happened. In the middle of winter, during one of the largest German offensives of the war, an entire army had pivoted, marched across difficult terrain, and forced its way into a surrounded position. German commanders studying the situation began to realize that something important had changed. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied front was now facing strong counterattacks. Bastogne, which had been expected to fall quickly, had instead become a major obstacle that consumed time, fuel, and manpower. And time was the one resource Germany could not replace. The arrival of Patton's forces did more than relieve a surrounded town. It disrupted the momentum of the entire German operation. Roads that were meant to carry armored divisions west were now contested. Units that had been advancing were forced to defend themselves from multiple directions. Across headquarters on both sides of the battlefield, officers began studying their maps again. The shape of the front line was starting to change. The bulge that had shocked the Allies days earlier was no longer expanding the way it once had. Instead, the pressure was beginning to push back.
In the days after the encirclement of Bastogne was broken, the battlefield across the Ardennes began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. The German offensive had started with shock, speed, and confidence. Entire sectors of the Allied line had collapsed in the first days of the attack. Columns of German tanks had pushed deep into enemy territory. For a brief moment, it had seemed possible that the gamble might succeed. But now, the momentum was shifting. The arrival of George Patton's forces at Bastogne did more than open a corridor to the town. It struck directly at one of the most vulnerable points of the German plan. The offensive had depended on rapid movement westward. Every delay created new problems: traffic jams, fuel shortages, confused coordination between units. Bastogne had already slowed the timetable. Now it had become a dangerous anchor, tying down German troops while Allied forces gathered strength. German commanders began reviewing reports from across the front. What they saw was troubling. American resistance had stiffened everywhere. Fresh units were arriving. Air power, grounded earlier by storms, was now attacking roads, bridges, and supply columns whenever the weather allowed. Vehicles that had advanced quickly during the first days were now struggling to move through damaged roads crowded with traffic. At headquarters, maps of the offensive told a story that was becoming harder to deny. The bulge in the Allied lines still existed, but it was no longer expanding the way it had at the beginning. In some areas, it had already stopped moving forward. In others, it was beginning to shrink under counterattacks. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, was responsible for stabilizing the situation. Known for his ability to manage difficult defensive battles, Model had been placed in charge of holding the front together while still attempting to push the offensive forward. But the reports arriving on his desk made it clear that the original timetable was collapsing. American forces were moving faster than expected.
Some German staff officers later recalled moments when new intelligence arrived showing how quickly Patton's army had maneuvered toward Bastogne. On situation maps, arrows representing American movements appeared sooner than anticipated. Positions that had been assumed secure were suddenly threatened. The speed of the response forced German planners to reconsider their assumptions. One story often repeated among historians involves a map studied by German officers during those days. According to accounts from the staff, Model marked one sector with a short comment written in red pencil. The note reportedly read, "Too fast." Whether written exactly that way or remembered slightly differently later, the meaning was clear. The American reaction had happened sooner than German planners expected. Another German commander, General Hasso von Montefel, had led one of the key armored forces during the offensive. He was considered intelligent, calm under pressure, and realistic about battlefield conditions. As the battle developed, he began to recognize that the situation was changing in ways that no longer favored Germany. The early success of the attack had depended on surprise and speed, but now both advantages were fading. American commanders were adapting quickly, shifting units, coordinating artillery, and using their enormous logistical capacity to keep armies moving, even in terrible winter conditions. Fuel shortages began affecting German armored units more severely. Some tanks had to be abandoned when supplies failed to reach them. Others were forced to limit movement, which slowed operations even further. Long columns of vehicles became vulnerable targets for Allied aircraft once the skies cleared. At the same time, the defense of Bastogne created a psychological impact beyond the town itself. The refusal of the surrounded troops to surrender, combined with the rapid arrival of relief forces, became a powerful signal throughout the Allied armies. Units that had been shocked during the first days of the German attack were regaining confidence. German soldiers noticed it too. Instead of retreating, American forces were attacking again. Every day that passed made the original objective of the offensive more unrealistic. Reaching the Meuse River had already become unlikely. Capturing Antwerp was now almost impossible. The massive gamble launched in December was slowly turning into a costly struggle to avoid a larger defeat. In military history, battles are often remembered for dramatic moments, a breakthrough, a last stand, a famous decision by a commander. But sometimes, the real turning point is quieter. It happens when experienced officers studying maps suddenly realize the battle is no longer developing in their favor. For several German commanders in the Ardennes, Bastogne became that moment. What had seemed like a small obstacle in the path of a massive offensive instead had disrupted the entire operation. A single road hub, defended by determined troops and reached by a rapidly maneuvering army, had forced the German advance to lose the momentum it needed to succeed. From that point forward, the initiative increasingly belonged to the Allies. More American forces continued arriving in the region. British units prepared defensive lines along key rivers. Air attacks intensified whenever the weather allowed. Gradually, the Bulge in the front line was pushed back as German units were forced onto the defensive. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, with heavy fighting and significant losses on both sides, but the moment when Bastogne was relieved marked a clear shift in the direction of the campaign. For many German officers reflecting on the battle later, the lesson was difficult but undeniable. The Allied armies, once underestimated by German planners earlier in the war, had become highly effective at large-scale operations. Their ability to move troops, coordinate attacks, and maintain pressure across a wide front had grown enormously. Speed, logistics, and organization, not just firepower, were now deciding the outcome. And in the frozen forests around Bastogne, that reality had become impossible to ignore.